Buenos dias. Thank you, Joylyn, for that beautiful introduction. Thank you also to Carlos and Lucien for inviting me to be here today in front of this incredible room of women. If only every room looked a little more like this. Am I right? Imagine what we could accomplish. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. But more importantly than that, I want to challenge you. I want to push you to imagine the shackles of society that are keeping you from reaching your full potential and what it would take for you to cast them off. I'm going to share a few things and a few lessons that I've learned in the hopes that you too can embrace some rulemaking. I come from a town of 2,000 people in the middle of Minnesota farmland, Paynesville. That's Paynesville. Now, people from Paynesville don't usually become diplomats. They don't really work at the White House, and they certainly don't marry Puerto Ricans. But now they do, because I did. My father was a man of limited education. He finished a semester of college before dropping out to tour the country in a rock band. But he was brilliant, an independent thinker, a voracious reader, and he always followed his own path, wrote his own rules, and encouraged me to do the same. As a child, I hated it. I wanted him to be just like everyone else because I wanted to be like everyone else. But he was always creating music, directing theater productions, and throwing caution to the wind. I thought it was so embarrassing. He always seemed to stand out just because of who he was. But little did I know that his constant questioning, why are you doing things this way? What's the moral of the story, Erin? Who said you can't? Would seep so deep into my being. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. My father was the first person in my life who gave me permission to break the rules, even when I didn't want to. And my first lesson for you is to surround yourself with people like my father, people who embrace you when you dare to challenge the status quo, with people who aren't afraid to ask why or why not. So, what rules did I break? Well, I decided to leave behind small-town life and go global. I joined the Foreign Service, where I served as a diplomat in Latin America, the Middle East, and in Washington, the State Department, and at the White House. I remember my first assignment in the Foreign Service. It was to Mexico, a beautiful, vibrant, complex country, where my role was sitting in a window all day, every day, and deciding whether Mexicans could come to the United States or not. It was terrible. And I remember when the head of human resources for the entire Foreign Service came to Mexico, I asked to meet him. I wanted to talk about my career. Because in my mind, I hadn't just left the top foreign affairs school in the United States to sit in a visa window for the rest of my life. I had things to contribute, energy to devote. And you know what he said to me? He said, "You know what your problem is, Erin? You're too ambitious. You need to wait for the Foreign Service to catch up with you." Let's just call that another rule that I broke. I never learned to wait for the Foreign Service to catch up with me. Through sheer tenacity, hard work, amazing mentors, and a lot of luck, I continued to defy the rules and rise to positions, quite frankly, I had no business holding. And I must have done something right. They sent me to the White House. And then on to run a cabinet agency's communications. And this brings me to the second lesson. Follow your instincts. Institutional wisdom can be very self-serving, and it may not be serving you. More rules were broken when my husband Miguel and I decided to spend 5 years commuting, often internationally, so we could follow our professional dreams. We decided to postpone starting a family, much to my mother's chagrin, and even some of our closest friends judged us harshly for our decisions. But I know they were just afraid. Afraid that if we could do something so unconventional, what would it mean for the sacrifices that they were making for their own marriages? But I knew, and Miguel knew, that if we endured the sacrifice today to achieve our goals professionally, that later we wouldn't be left wondering, what if? And looking at each other with some sense of blame for the other. From this experience comes lesson number 3. What's right for you may not be right for anyone else, and that's okay. Don't be afraid to chart your own path. It was this same rule-breaking mentality that led me to quit the Foreign Service at the peak of my career. I was on the fast track to the top. I had proven myself in yet another role I probably wasn't supposed to have, and I could have probably had my pick of any jobs anywhere in the world. But I was unhappy. I felt unfulfilled, and I was chafing at the confines of the bureaucracy. And I didn't want to put my personal life on the back burner for my career anymore. To top it off, my father died. He was 60 years old and just starting to think about retirement. The week before his death, he was in New York visiting me, and I spent the entire week working. The little time I spent with him, I was distracted, or thinking about work. His death was the most painful lesson I've ever learned. I'll never get that week back to spend with him the right way. But that pain was also a gift. It forced me to reevaluate my priorities, and I was determined to try to do better. So, a few months later, as I welcomed my first child into the world, I quit. I had no idea what I was going to do next, or whether I'd want to go back to work, but I was really lucky to have a spouse who had insisted on saving money so that we would have options in the future should I wish to do something as rule-breaking as quitting my pensioned career without any idea for what would come next. So this brings me to lesson number 4. Ask yourself if really, truly, you'd rather live unhappily than with uncertainty. I think if you really stop to consider the trade-offs, you also might decide to embrace the unknown. I spent several months enjoying motherhood and realized quickly that I wanted to go back to work. So I started talking to everyone and anyone about their careers, what they entailed, and thinking about whether it might be a good fit for me. In the end, I turned down a high-profile job advising a billionaire so that I could start a public affairs consulting business. Now, mind you, I had 0 experience in this field. I'd never serviced clients before, and I had no idea if I could actually do this. But I said yes because it gave me freedom and autonomy. And it turned out in the end, I was pretty good at it. Good enough so that today I only take the kinds of projects that I want to work on and that get me out of bed in the morning. And this brings me to the next lesson. When you do what you love, the results speak for themselves. Don't be afraid to do the things you know in your heart you're meant to do, no matter what the conventional wisdom says. More recently, I put this lesson into practice again by moving to Puerto Rico. Thanks. I left behind a comfortable life in New York where my kids were happy and my husband and I were finally under one roof. Why did I take this leap? Well, it wasn't because my husband was clamoring for it. I can tell you that. It took me years to convince him to come back to his island, a place I've always loved. I even made him marry me here. But I did it because I saw then, and I see now, the potential of Puerto Rico, if only we roll up our sleeves and get to work creating the future we all seek here. That's also why yesterday we launched Puerto Rico Live. It's a new venture to bring the world to Puerto Rico through a series of onstage conversations. Thank you. I've never done anything like this before, but I saw a need to bridge the gaps that exist between Puerto Rico and the outside world, and I wanted to address it in my own small way. So that brings me to you. I'm here today to challenge you to break the rules. Take the job that isn't the straight line to where you think you want to go, but that gives you butterflies in your stomach. Dig deep. Launch the startup that will tackle some of the needs this island faces. For those of you in the diaspora, dare to come home, even when people tell you it's crazy. Forget about status and think about your happiness. And you know how I know you can do it? Because I saw hundreds of thousands of you take to the streets this summer. You stood up and you said you'd had enough with the status quo that wasn't working. You inspired the world. You inspired the world with your peaceful activism, your yoga activism, your kayaking, and even tu perreo. You don't have to be the smartest person in the room to break the rules. I'm not. You just have to have the courage and the tenacity to put yourself out there, to trust in what you are capable of. I don't mean to sugarcoat it. Change doesn't come easily, and sometimes we fail. But change happens when one by one we decide to break the rules so that collectively the systems that have worked for the very few begin to unravel, opening the door to something new. And you've shown me and everyone else that you can break the rules and succeed. And I hope you do it again. Thank you.